Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Kevin Burkham, CEO of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, um, and we are pleased to welcome you to our fifth in a series of webinars on the potential for U.S. agriculture to be greenhouse gas negative. That is a report that USFRA published late last year. It was peer-reviewed by the National Academy of Sciences, conducted by 26 independent scholars, two of which are joining us today. And that study points out what's possible for U.S. agriculture and the fact that it is possible to reduce GHG emissions, to improve carbon sequestration, and importantly, improve farmer profitability. U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, in case you aren't aware, we are a farmer-led organization that works to champion U.S. agriculture. Our membership includes 700,000 U.S. farmers across the livestock and row crop sectors, and we try to raise the voice of farmers and ranchers on important issues. And so we want to welcome you here today. I mentioned that study, Potential for U.S. Agriculture to be Greenhouse Gas Negative, it actually identified 5 key opportunities for agriculture. And today we're talking about closing the row crop yield gap, which is one of the 5. Earlier this year, we have done some webinars on nitrogen fertilizer management. That was the subject of the first webinar we did way back in April. The second was on soil carbon management, which was discussed at our second webinar in May. Animal production agriculture was the topic of our third webinar in June, and on September 9th, we had a webinar on the opportunities around agriculture and agriculture and energy use efficiency. And you can view all of those recordings on the homepage of USFRA, usfarmersandranchers.org, as well as our YouTube page. We are fortunate to have a very distinguished panel for you today. Dr. Jerry Hatfield, who is formerly of USDA ARS, Agricultural Research Service, and Dr. Lollato of Kansas State University. They are two of the authors of the Closing the Row Crop Yield Gap chapter in the Potential for U.S. Ag to be Greenhouse Gas Negative report. They, along with Dr. Elizabeth Ainsworth of the University of Illinois, shout out to U of I, ILL, and Deanna Osmond of North Carolina State University. Today, Drs. Hatfield and Lollato will be providing a summary of the key findings from that particular chapter of the report. Other speakers today include Sean Arians of the National Corn Growers Association. Welcome, Sean. And Patrick Giberson, who is a New Jersey farmer and member of the United Soybean Board, and also a member of the Board of Directors of U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action. Before we get started today, just a couple of quick housekeeping announcement. The event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube and Vimeo channels. We invite you to engage with the conversation today, so use the chat function or the Q&A function. We will try to respond, and I ask the speakers today to try to respond to some of those questions in real time throughout the session today. We may reserve a couple of key questions for the end during our discussion, and there will be time at the end of our webinar today for those questions. Well, let's go ahead and get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker today, Dr. Jerry Hatfield. Jerry is not only one of the authors of this chapter, but he was also one of the co-authors of the entire report that I referenced earlier, along with Dr. Chuck Rice and Dr. Marty Matlock. Jerry, the floor is yours, please.
All right, let me get that. So there we go. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks for that warm introduction and everything else. And it is my pleasure to do this along with Dr. Lollato. As Kevin said, we are 2 of the 4 authors on this report in terms of closing the row crop yield gap, because if we look in terms of not only how do we look at carbon neutrality, but also how do we improve stability of crop production and everything else. Understanding the yield gap is really kind of important in all of this. And so uh, we put together this chapter as part of that overall report. These are the four co-authors that are involved in that. I do a lot of work on climate impacts and looking at this, and spent a lot of time on yield gaps over my career. Elizabeth Ainsworth is a plant physiologist that does a lot of work on photosynthetic efficiency. Deanna Osborne has done a lot of her work over time looking at nutrient use efficiency. How do we manage that? Romulo is an agronomist looking at how do we look at management pieces of this. And when I finish my portion, he'll talk about just some of the management opportunities, which we think will be of great importance to this audience. So the major question we always get is, why the interest in yield gaps? And it really, as we go through this, is to understand that these are metrics, metrics that, are we making progress? And then metrics and saying, where are we failing to do this? And so you can look at either, are we going forward or going backward? And it also gives us a metric that allows us to determine what factors may be limiting in all of this. So that's really kind of the structure of how do we think about yield gaps. There's been a lot of work done around the world in this, but it's always important to start talking about some definitions. When everybody says yield gap, well, what is that? Well, you can come up with many different ways. That you got actual yield, that's what the producer gets. The attainable yield is kind of a metric that says that's the highest county level yield if we look at a county level basis for any given year. Weather's perfect, nutrient management's all perfect, there's no diseases, that there's a few years, and I'll show you some of those. There's potential yield that is often done with in terms of crop models to say, can we simulate this and saying, here's the maximum yield out of this. The yield gap can either be the obtainable minus the actual yield, and then or the potential minus the actual yield. So it's always important to understand, what our metrics are and how we're computing this and everything else. But there's been a lot of work done. In fact, there's a whole yield gap atlas that's out there. There's actually yieldgap.org that you can go and pull out their atlas. And they talk about, yield potential, water limiting yield potential. We talk about irrigated areas, water productivity. Tony Fisher and his colleagues, Byerly and Eames, put together a whole book. It's about 700 pages looking at yield gaps across all these different crops. And I just summarized a little of that saying, what are we doing in terms of the yield gap on wheat, which is about 50% right now, but it's still closing at about 0.2% a year. But that varies between actually not closing it and closing it. Corn, we're going at about 0.06%. Rice, soybeans about 1% a year in terms of closure. Pulses, we got a lot of work to do on pulses yet in terms of understanding how to close some of that yield gap, because they really have not paid a lot of attention to that crop, and how do we begin to look at this. And so I just pulled out a couple different examples. I downloaded the NASS data for US corn production. This is national data and everything else. We fit that attainable line is kind of an upper frontier analysis. We do an upper quadrant quartile analysis, and you see it just fits the upper points of this. And then we take that line and make that the attainable yield, and then actually every year, and that's yield gap on the side. And then I just took and regressed what was happening on the yield gap relative to time. And you can see in corn, we've made pretty good progress in terms of closing that yield gap over time and everything else. This is soybeans. There's some really good years in that are scattered about in all of that. But the yield gap, if we look at the last 10 years, they're showing significant increase. If we just take and isolate the last 10 or 15 years, says that we're closing that yield gap over that whole period from 1960 through 2025. It's not not showing any trend at all in everything. So you have to be very selective about what we're looking at in all of this. And this is wheat production on the U.S. level. And you can see that there's some pretty large yield gaps as we go along in terms of the national data that's out there. And we can begin to see this as well. But if you look at all of this and really what this begins to understand for us is that here's our major limitations to yield. Obviously, water, nutrients, temperature is an impact. Solar radiation is even an impact at times, because if we have a season that has a lot of rain and is cloudy, we're not getting full photosynthetic efficiency. There's pests that are involved, either weeds, insects, or diseases in all of this. So these are the major limitations to yield that we look at. Where we've done yield gap analysis across the Midwest, looking at a very detailed analysis of this on a county level, is that here's the major factors that influence corn. July maximum temperature shows up because that disrupts pollination. August minimum temperatures, because that influences the efficiency of grain fill. The warmer the August minimum temperatures, the more rapidly that plant matures, the less efficient our grain filling period. And obviously, July-August precipitation across the Midwest is really critical. In soybeans, you isolated out in all of this. And this is based on 50 years of data that we've analyzed across by county across the Midwest. August minimum temperatures and still are very effective in soybeans in terms of influencing that efficiency of grain fill. July-August precipitation, obviously water supply. Wheat is much more interesting because it's really the precipitation during the grain filling period that is the driving factor. There's so few incidences when we have really high temperatures or really cold temperatures that influence that, but it doesn't show up very statistically within that whole piece of that puzzle. So it's still driven by precipitation. But we look at a framework of looking and saying, how do we begin to look at this genetic potential? That's the genetics piece of this. The environment, what are the environmental factors? That could be soil variation within fields. The weather environment obviously is there. But what it's allowing us to do with this G by E by M interaction is start saying, what are the management options for increasing both potential as well as the actual yield? And in balance, we really need to increase both of those. We need to increase yield potential, but we also need to increase the actual as well as the yield. And so if we think about this, from a standpoint, the greater the decrease that we can get in the yield gap, the more carbon that we pull out, the more carbon neutral we become, more efficient we're in terms of utilizing nutrients, particularly nitrogen in corn, because that's one of our big energy inputs into that. We can become more carbon neutral because of our greater efficiency of use of our natural resources. So this is our framework that we often look at and say, how do we begin to bring this together? Throughout this whole chapter that we pulled together, you see these different pieces. We even talked about what we could do with photosynthetic efficiency. A little bit of pieces of this. And now we're talking about things that might change 1 or 2%, but when you take 1 or 2% and you add it over a whole growing season, that becomes a major impact on how we're growing this plant. So the question obviously is how can we close the yield gap? We can build more resilient cropping systems to environmental stresses. How do we do that? How do we look at that genetic resource to do that? How do we look at management options? How do we look at yield limitations at both the field as well as the farm scale? This is where management comes into this, and all these different pieces. Can we improve the decision-making process at the field scale to help producers evaluate what's limiting their efficient use of resources, whether it be light, water, nutrients? And personally, I'm a big fan of on-farm experimentation that allows us to evaluate practices at the producer scale. I think as we begin to look at this from an on-farm place, with all the yield monitors, the control equipment that we have, conducting on-farm research and on-farm experimentation is very doable. But we've got to work together with producers, agribusiness, researchers to be able to make this happen and everything. So that's kind of the overall introduction into yield gaps. I'm going to quit sharing and turn it over to Romulo, who will take us through some of the management options that we have with that. So, Romulo?
Excellent. Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. There we go. Yeah, so thanks, Jerry, for the introduction there. And as Jerry mentioned, I will focus more on some examples, right, of how and where different management practices were used either to close the yield gap and when available, put that in the context of going towards carbon neutrality, right? And one thing that is also important for us to remember, we tend to think of U.S. agriculture as a whole, but when we're thinking of crops like soybean, in many parts of the world that is not here in the US, and I'll give it the example back home, and home for me is in Brazil, right? The increase in production in soybean, a lot of it has been led by increasing area as well. And that area increase is actually encroaching into very fragile environments like the Amazon, right? And so by narrowing the yield gap, we're also contributing in that sense. So instead of area expansion, actually increasing actual yields towards their potential, actually helping to some extent protect some of those more fragile environments as well. But here, right, in the context of management practices, the way that we wrote this chapter and we kind of split things here were management practices that are impacting our yield potential or our attainable yield, right, versus the management practices that are perhaps not impacting our potential yield, but impacting the actual yield in the farm. Whenever we're considering closing yield gaps, it's also important to keep in mind that it needs to be economical, right? And we look at many research that have been published out there and some of the new research, some of the data that we're working on currently. In time in and time out, it seems like we're not necessarily wanting to 100% close that yield gap, because many times if we're trying to shoot for the yield potential, it's not going to be economical, right? But if you're reaching about in between 70 or 80% of that yield potential, that tends to be the sweet spot of where we're maxing out production and maxing out profit as well. Very well. So let's dive into some of these examples, right, as we're coming up with that book and that review, that book chapter of management practice. And we're going to start off with those that have been shown to influence the yield potential of the different crops. And a management practice that will impact the yield potential of the crop, it will essentially change the environment to which that crop is exposed, right? So for example, you see here in this map, it's a map of the U.S. Corn Belt, right? And this is a paper published back in 2017, where all of these little red points that you see in the upper graph, they are soybean fields. So here the researchers went out and they sat down with growers and they asked different questions about how each one of those fields were being managed, right? And they were working with thousands and thousands of fields here. I think in this publication, close to about 3,000 fields, but they reached this database, I think it's close to 8,000 or 9,000 fields now. So really a huge amount of data coming directly from farmers' fields. And these different colors here are different climate zones. So think about these different colors in this larger map as zones where the climate is more similar than the neighboring zone. And so we can kind of group fields within those different colors, right? And here we're going to talk the example about sowing dates for soybeans, right? So again, this is a soybean in the U.S. Corn Belt. And we can look at this next chart here, which is showing these black lines, essentially, as Jerry was mentioning, the concept of attainable yield, right? Here is essentially that concept of attainable yield and how for the majority of these regions, we can see here for example, the colors of this graph, they relate back to where we're looking at here. So red, for example, would be this north central Kansas, south central Nebraska, and green is as we go to Iowa and other states, right? So you can see here. And for the majority of these regions here, there is a pretty steep penalty in yield potential, right, if we are delaying planting date for soybean, right? And we can see that the slope of the line, this is about 33. You can almost convert these in pounds per acre per day. So roughly, you're losing anywhere from 12 to about 33 pounds per acre per day in yield potential of soybean if we're delaying our planting date. So again, for delaying planting date, you're changing the environment to which that crop is going to be exposed, especially during the critical period for grain yield determination. And with that, you change the yield potential of that crop. How far can we push, right? Now, all these points that are below the black line, they're pretty far from the yield potential. So there's something else limiting them, which is not planting date, right? So that's other causes of yield gap that are not planting date. But again, this chart is showing how delaying planting date affects soybean yield potential. Let's look at a similar exercise, but looking for at wheat in Kansas now. So here we have the state of Kansas, and each one of these red points are different fields that we went out there. We talked to growers and try to understand their different management practices, again, at the commercial field level, not necessarily in small research plots. And here, if we look at Western Kansas, a region that is very high in elevation, and so gets cold temperatures fairly quick in the fall. We have planting date here, and that black line is, again, our attainable yield. We see a fairly early peak in that yield potential, and a very steep decline in the yield potential as well as we are delaying planting date. Quite different from, for example, South Central Kansas, right, where it's a warmer region, lower altitudes, and so a later planting optimum and not nearly as steep of a decline in attainable yield as we're delaying planting date. So this is one example, right? That planting date really changes the environment in which the crop is exposed to, and therefore impacting our yield potential. Another practice that typically can impact yield potential as well is going to be the crop rotation, right? Or the cropping system where this crop is inserted into. And a lot of times that comes because of either changes in planting date. If you're double cropping a crop after another, you're almost necessarily planting it later than the optimum. Or again, changes in that environment. In this case here, I'm going to give the example of substituting fallow period in Western Kansas with cover crops. And essentially, cover crops have shown many benefits in different research out there, but in semi-arid environments like Western Kansas, they do use water, right? And so anytime they were replacing fallow with cover crops, again, we're impacting the environment which that crop is exposed to. In this case here, we are that cover crop is reducing the amount of plant available water at planting of the wheat crop, and of course the wheat yield being related to the plant available water in the growing season. So again, these just two examples, one in planting dates and one in crop rotations, right, where we have a direct impact of this management practice in our yield potential. Now, crop rotation, of course, will also impact the yield of the crop for other reasons, right? This here, we're looking at corn grain yield, and we're not necessarily talking about the potential here, but the grain yield of the crop, if it is in rotation with soybean or a continuous corn crop. These are commercial fields from central Nebraska, right? So again, we have data from about 120 commercial fields here from central Nebraska. And fairly consistently across years, there was a benefit of growing corn after soybeans instead of continuous corn. And then this may be for a number of different reasons, right? Perhaps weed control is easier if you're actually having some sort of crop rotation. Can there be some leftover nitrogen from the soybean crop as well, perhaps? So again, not necessarily a reason that is impacting the yield potential of the crop, but simply facilitating our agronomic management, perhaps of weeds, right, when we're rotating out of cereal crops. And the graph here in the bottom just shows how that soybean maize yields are typically greater than continuous maize yields, almost irrespective of whether we're doing disc tillage or ridge till or no till, right? So especially if you're in continuous maize, right, there is an yield penalty there if we're, for example, continuous maize no till, right? It improves if you're disc, so there's probably something there related to weed control as well, or other factors. But again, that effect of rotation on the actual yield of the crop by facilitating some of our management in season. Now, there will be a multitude of things we could talk about, right? Think of the number of decisions that farmers make on a daily basis for their different crops. It is regarding fertility or pest control or planting dates and so on. So really, there's too many things for us to cover, and that was not really the goal of the chapter, right? But there is some evidence there that, some incremental changes in productivity as we are adopting different things at the same time, right? So this is just an example for wheat in Australia there. If they are doing business as usual, right, fairly low yield levels, if they are trying to improve stubble retention for soil moisture and weed and so on, doing weed control. So you see these incremental gains in productivity, right, from weeding during the fallow and then adding a legume to the rotation, planting earlier, and then using new genotypes. So again, it was not the objective of this chapter to review each management practice in detail, but really just to give a perspective of things that are impacting the yield potential, the actual yield of the crop, and how we need to be thinking from a systems perspective. Very similarly to this example here in Australia was this one, which is corn in Ethiopia. So again, going from that system with no adaptation, using incremental changes to really bring about increases in productivity at the farm level. So again, probably beyond the scope of what we're doing here today to talk about each one of these in individual detail. But one thing that I wanted to show is this potential, right, for crop management to simultaneously narrow yield gaps and lead to carbon neutrality or a reduction in global warming potential. So I'm going to go back to two examples here. One is this example of this survey that we've done here in Kansas. And again, each one of those yellow points is a commercial field where we sat down with growers and we collected information on what they were doing. So we did this for 3 growing seasons in a row. We got data from about 700 commercial wheat-free fields. So pretty interesting data set to work with. You can see the distribution of it in reference to the wheat area in this map. And we were asking growers, what was the planting date? What was the variety? How much nitrogen was put out? When was this nitrogen split? Was there a fungicide? So really kind of asking growers everything that was done to each one of those 700 fields. And then once we had all this information, we went out and we did what we call a life cycle assessment. Now, life cycle assessment, many of you may be familiar with it. If you are not, it's essentially a way that we can calculate the carbon footprint of that crop, right? So again, what we're trying to do here is look for high yields with a lower carbon footprint. And to do that is essentially we're getting every single operation that is done in that field, right? And we are going all the way from what we call the cradle, right? The cradle for that operation. So if we're putting 50 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer, okay, what was the global warming potential to produce that pound of fertilizer, to package that pound of fertilizer, and to transport it to the field, and then to apply it in the field, right? So we're considering everything here in this analysis, all the way from the inception of each of those inputs being used in the field. Same thing with seed production. How many pounds of seed per acre were used? Okay, so how does that translate into a global warming potential of that unit of seed, right? So again, for every single input that we have in each one of those 700 fields, we're going from the cradle, so from the manufacturing, packaging, and transportation of those inputs all the way to the farm gates. When we're harvesting the field at the farm gate, what does it look like? And so essentially here we have a global warming potential, right, in units of CO2 equivalent per hectare, kilos per hectare, right? It's very similar to pounds per acre here. And we have a distribution of these 700 fields, wheat fields in Kansas. And the main thing that calls my attention here is the range, right? We have almost a twofold or over a twofold in global warming potential across these different fields, commercial fields, right? And so growers are managing their fields very differently. There's a twofold range in global warming potential of those fields. Now, if we think, okay, fields that are with a larger global warming potential at least are yielding more, maybe we can justify that, right? So let's look how this global warming potential of each one of these fields relate back to their yield. And what we have is a big scatter, right? There's really a big scatter here, meaning that, you have fields that are actually costing quite a bit to the environment, and they have very low yields, and that's exactly where we don't want to be, right? So essentially, but this to me, this scatter really kind of shows an opportunity to me, because, for example, if we come up with, you can look at this many different ways. We've come up with quadrant analysis, for example, right? You have in this upper left corner here, pretty much our benchmark, right? Here we have those fields that have low impact and high yield. So that's kind of where we want to be, right? A low impact to the environment and high yield. Then we have fields with high impact and high yield as well. And now the opportunity here is, since we collected all that management data, let's compare, right, how these fields are actually being managed differently. And let's try to come up with solutions for these fields on the upper right quadrant to reduce their footprint, but still maintain high yields, right? After all, try to narrow the yield gap. And same thing for the other quadrants, right? How do we bring these fields that have a low impact but a low yield? How could they potentially improve their yields, maintaining a low impact? So we went back and we contrasted the adoption of these different practices across these three different groups, right? So this very first column that you see with data, right? So let me, so where my pointer is here, this very first column that you see with data, that's that benchmark that I talked about. So this is low impact, high yield, kind of where we want to be, right? And this here is the low impact, low yield. So how can we improve yields here, maintaining low impact? And high impact, high yield, what can we do here to have a lower impact, still maintain yields, right? And if there is an asterisk there, it means that these values were statistically different from the ones in our benchmark, suggesting perhaps an opportunity for improvement, right? So for example, this is just the yield and the global warming potential of those fields, but total nitrogen applied, right? It seems like those low impact fields, low yield, were applying less nitrogen than our benchmark. But those high yield, high impact were probably applying a little bit too much, right? I mean, that optimum, our benchmark is kind of in between here, kind of showing an opportunity for better nitrogen management. Total phosphorus applied also seemed that it was a bit on the excessive end, or at least, I mean, it may be an opportunity here for us to reduce so the footprint of some of these high yielding, high impact fields. Nitrogen source was also different, that there was a higher adoption of UAN, for example, compared to urea or anhydrous in our benchmark group of fields. In fluorophosphorus as well, so it seems like it was more frequently adopted in our benchmark. Tillage practice. So again, we can go over many of these practices, but the idea here is we have ways to identify those practices that are likely leading to higher yields with a lower environmental footprint. And this was the example for wheat in Kansas. We can kind of look at the same type of a framework for corn in Nebraska, right? And you see here, again, those yellow points are commercial wheat, commercial corn fields that in Nebraska, where they got data for their management. And calculated the global warming potential. So what we have here is, again, those, let's look at the right-hand side first, which is the global warming potential, right, of those fields. Here we have 3 years of data, and the very same story of wheat, like a scatter plot, a scatter shot, right? There's no relationship between fields that are with higher global warming leading to higher yields. It's just a scatter. So there's opportunities there for us to reduce the footprint of some of these higher yielding fields or increase the yield of some of those lower yielding fields. And here we have another metric, which is energy input. So in the beginning, Kevin mentioned that there was a talk a few weeks back about energy efficiency, right? So again, this is another metric similarly that we evaluate in some of these type of global warming studies. So very similar story there in terms of energy input and grain yields. Again, perhaps having some opportunities there to both improve our net energy yield via management or reduce our global warming potential. And this is one of the ways that the researchers here did that analysis, right? So comparing pivot irrigation with surface irrigation, for example, if it is in a rotation of soybean maize versus a continuous maize, right? That's how it is impacting the global warming potential. Now, this is important to mention that this is yield scaled, right? So it's units of CO2 equivalent per ton of grain, right? It's not, so this is, we're actually looking at the grain, not at a per hectare basis here. But again, pivot irrigation resulting in a lower grain footprint as compared to surface irrigation, right? And especially if you're looking at the maize yield, corn yield, if it's on a soybean rotation, since should be more lower footprint as well. And here is net energy yield. So these kind of, we're looking at the other way around. Larger is better on this case here, right? On net energy yield. And global warming potential, lower is better. So again, just a few examples here. Our goal is not to cover every single potential management practice out there, but just to highlight that, yes, there are management practices out there that we can fine tune to really make sure that we have high yields and a low environmental footprint of the crop. Here, if you're interested, there's some of the literature that we use in this presentation, and I think we have a couple of other speakers coming up here, but Jerry and I will be happy to get any questions either now or towards the end, if there are any.
Thank you, Dr. Lollato. I really appreciate that. And we are running a bit behind, but I did want to ask one quick question, because you brought up the need for it to be economical, some of these management practices. There's really some great questions that are coming in on the chat in terms of the quadrant approach, how it relates to farmer margin. You talked about nitrogen efficiency, nutrient efficiency, certainly is related to farmer margin as well. Can you give us 30 seconds or less on that?
Absolutely, and now I wish I had added that slide, because I do have that data, right? So we did put that data in this context here, and essentially the way whenever we plot grain yield, or sorry, if we understand what's driving profit, usually it's a fairly linearly profit. I mean, everything that we're making out of the field minus the costs, right? It's fairly linearly related to grain yield, meaning that for us to be profitable, we need to yield more, right? Now, if we try to relate grain yield with the total cost to produce that field, it's usually the same thing that I'm showing for global warming. It's a scatter again. So it's about using those inputs more efficiently, right? And that shows very clearly in this farmer data. If we plot yield and profit, very linearly related. If we plot yield and cost of production, scatter plot. So meaning we have opportunities to yield more using our inputs more efficiently.
Terrific. Thank you for that. And at the end of this session, we're going to talk a little bit about some research that Jerry's been doing for USFRA along with Bruno Basso on nitrogen efficiency and yield stability. So we'll talk more about that. Very timely. Please put questions in the chat for Dr. Lollato and Jerry Hatfield. They'll be sticking around for the Q&A session here shortly. But I want to move on to our next speaker, who is Sean Arians. Sean is VP of Sustainable Production and Value Chain Management with the National Corn Growers Association. It's great to have Sean here. Sean is also a farmer here in Illinois. So Sean, the floor is yours, please.
Thanks, Kevin, and certainly appreciate Dr. Hatfield and Lollato sharing that. And I was just going to take a few minutes to really talk through what are the things that, as we look from not only national corn growers, but as the corn industry, what are the opportunities for us that I think we're hit on? Would just like to highlight those a little bit more. And, you know, as Dr. Hatfield talked about the genetic potential, I think for us, that is the easy button. That is the one that is already partially solved. Thinking about, we have a lot of potential. It's really the levers that, as he talks about, G by E by M, and that environment and management are really where we spend a lot of time, and I think was alluded to in the latter half of just what are those different environments that are influencing our ability to implement a management practice, and how do those practices truly impact the output. So for instance, something that you know, we are actively engaged with soy and pork on a project called Farmers for Soil Health, implementing, trying to get farmers to adopt cover crops, and really just a pay for practice at this point approach to give that a try. And part of the challenge as we think about farmers adopting cover crops is, for my farm in Northern Illinois, I can't plant cover crops. They were actually planted just a week ago. And if you look at the weather today, it's less than 50 degrees. Thankfully, rye will continue to grow. But as we think about this influence of changing that lever of a management practice ahead of a crop and where I am in a region, those are all going to have different outcomes, as Dr. Lollato kind of shared that brush approach of the color palette from west to northeast. Those are all going to influence differently. And I think, Kevin, you might have had a question of just this whole cropping system, of the complexity of what that really means for one crop versus all, and the systems approach. So this is exciting to think about because we know the potential is there with genetics, and that will continue to improve. How do we get better than the 0.5% or 0.6% improvement in closing that gap? So, we talked about cover crops management practices. We think about environment, and certainly the things that have been a bit of headwinds that I would say we don't even spend enough time talking about are the number of cloudy days we have that impact solar radiation, that influences photosynthesis in the plant, and thus the outcome that was, again, alluded to today. But we've had a lot more wildfire smoke across the upper Midwest and the Midwest than we've probably experienced, at least for me. I'd say the last 5 years, we've had more of that than the last 25. And that also influences solar radiation and thus impacting yields. So, I think a number of us can say, oh yeah, we've experienced those, or we recognize it's going on in our world and impacted by climate and climate change. We don't necessarily know the true tale, so to speak, of that influence on this yield gap and opportunity. So just thinking about it is, getting my head wrapped around some of these things, and hearing the presentation as well, because certainly you can read it, but until you have the context, it provides a little bit more information. The other thing that will be interesting as we move forward in how do we close this yield gap is certainly the crop rotation that's alluded to in the questions. Also, what are the tools in our toolbox? And I think on my farm, I've been no-tilling for 100% now for the last 4 years. I've been no-till / cover crop ahead of soybeans for the last 12 years. And as I think about that, we have a residue, I'll say, challenge. It's not necessarily a problem because those all influence soil health. But we now have tools in our toolbox thinking about biologicals and what can those do for us, and not necessarily, as farmers refer to them, a bug in a jug. I think we have some more advancements thinking about algae products and other maybe not so sensitive biologicals that can help us, because we need pesticides and herbicides that can help us in that avenue. We want more tools in the toolbox, and biologicals can be another part of that. That, of course, will play well into how do we continue to feed this crop more naturally? How do we manage against some of these things that, sometimes we're our own worst enemies? As we think about closing the yield gap, when I produce 250 bushel corn, what does that do for me? Well, it gives me a lot more stover that now I have to figure out how do I break down the residue, and that changes my carbon to nitrogen cycle that is going on in this environment as well. So it is a vicious cycle that we all try to do, whether it's adding more acres and then I need bigger equipment, or growing more yield and now I create a different challenge as we think about just the management and environment that we're somewhat creating for ourselves and what we have to manage through. But I would say in the last 2 years, I've used a new product, and just for simplicity's sake, I won't name it, but it is a biological in the biological section, so to speak, but it's an algae product And I'd say it's been the most promising that I've seen that can actually, isn't so environmentally sensitive based off of thinking about I have sand, I have clay, and I have some pretty black sandy loam that is really good soil. I want to be able to variable rate where I can, but I also want to be able to use a tool like this biological across all of my acres and have it work. So I think those are just a few of the things by way of how do I manage cover crops? How do you manage some of the biologicals, those decisions? And what are the things that we're excited about and seeing, and also just maybe a few other things for Dr. Lollato and Dr. Hatfield to think about in phase 2 or 3 of this, as we create our own challenges with the environment and management. How do we continue to look at that and really evaluate those outcomes? So those are just a few thoughts that I had in reviewing and then also listening, and appreciate the opportunity to share those with all of you this afternoon.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate that perspective, both from industry at NCGA as well as your own personal experience as a farmer and a grower. One of the charts that Dr. Hatfield showed was the progress that the corn industry has made in terms of closing the yield gap, and it's really impressive. Can you talk more about that? How that's happening? How your growers are making that progress in this topic?
Yeah, and I would say it's a number of things. We have gotten better at how we manage fertility, and it was alluded to, with some of where the high impact, high yield. I think we're starting to be a little bit more realistic of where's that happy medium of not necessarily needing as much nitrogen as we thought we once did to produce a high yielding crop. There's certainly a lot more tools in the toolbox as we think about equipment and our ability to variable rate and manage by environment, where it's not planter width anymore. It's really, one row at a time, and really adopting variable rate technology. And then I do think the other component is hybrid selection, and some of that information has become a bit more ubiquitous for farmers to access of how can I make better selections for the environments and the risk that I'm trying to manage, whether it be, fungicides is certainly another thing. Those are some tools that I believe farmers are adopting and more open to. How can I manage risk outside of just a price risk, but a yield risk in capitalizing on what the genetics have the opportunity to produce?
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that. And Sean is going to be sticking around for the Q&A session. So please, and I know there's a couple questions that have been coming in since you've been speaking, Sean. So we'll continue that dialogue. But I want to move on to our next speaker, who is Patrick Giberson. Patrick is a soy checkoff farmer leader from New Jersey. He is also one of the newest members of the USFRA Board of Directors, representing the United Soybean Board. He's going to talk a little bit more about how he's working and tackling the challenge of closing the yield gap on his farm in New Jersey. Patrick, the floor is yours, please.
All right. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you to everybody in front of me here. Dr. Hatfield, Dr. Lollato, Sean, great job there. Tough act to follow, I guess, now. But anyway, on the soybean end of it, it's one of those things that I think, we both farm corn and soybeans, and it's not that we're just one or the other. With corn, I do believe that, genetics has probably came further than what we've done with soybeans. I mean, we're working on it. Some varietal issues that, have gotten better as far as water usage, drought tolerance, and those type of things, where corn's kind of been in the forefront with that. And I think one of the things too, going back to the charts that we had and the graphs, one of the things I liked about it was going back 30 years on soybeans and where we've come to on that line of potential yield and the actual yield that we're getting out of it. Going back into the 60s and the 70s, corn has been king in this country. And beans were kind of an afterthought as a scavenger to pick up whatever the corn didn't use. That's kind of what we did with the rotation end of it. So, I think now looking at them more as a cash crop moving forward, that's kind of changing that outlook too, that yield potential has grown on that. We're not looking at soybeans as a second class citizen, so to speak, in the agricultural industry. One of the things too, and going back to the interest that I had in talking about the planting dates or sowing dates, we've done some experiments too, and as Sean was saying, biologicals and other things that we're trying. We usually try to put 20-acre plots here or there, or a 40-acre plot here or there, just trying different things. And planting dates, I think with soybeans, one of those things too. It also coincides with the maturity range that you're putting in. Like in our area here in New Jersey, we try to get stuff in the ground probably around the 18th of April is kind of my ideal, depending once again on weather, which is a big factor in it. This year we were cold and wet. We got beans in the ground. They came out of the ground and they just stood there. They didn't go anywhere. You didn't have the sunlight. You didn't have that solar radiation to get anything going. It didn't warm up. They had wet feet. They weren't happy. But we had done a test a couple years ago with we run in-furrow on our soybeans too when we plant. So we run an in-furrow fertilizer. We run a biologic in there, and we also run a fungicide in there. So with that being said, it actually helps that plant out a little bit earlier in the growth cycle. And we've seen some pretty good yield bumps by doing that. So I think overall there's a lot of testing that can be done, and moving forward within that. Some of the issues that we've had in the past too with doing that was we picked the wrong maturity. And so like with us, we're about a 3.6, 3.7, 3.8 range at that early planting date. And our goal is what we were trying to do is get to that June 21st, longest day, having those beans full bloom, really ready to go. So they're getting that most radiation and trying to get as most photosynthesis that they can out of that day. And it seemed to have worked. I know that there's been some other studies done on that, but the only funky thing about soybeans, it seems like some years you can throw the kitchen sink at them and see nothing. Other years, I don't know, that corn seems to be more consistent than a soybean when it comes to things you can do with it. One year you'll get great results out of it. The next year it seems like nothing ever happens. But I think treatments, fungicides, it's especially early planting. It does make a difference than just putting a naked soybean in the ground. One of the other things too is there's been a lot of studies on population versus yield. And back in the day, we used to sow by the bushel. It had nothing to do with seed count per acre. Now our sweet spot early on, because we figure a little mortality or emergence problems, we're at about 140,000, and we'll actually go down. This is in 15-inch rows. We'll go down to a 90,000 population. And you really don't see a big difference, especially in the later beans at that 90,000. They seem to branch out a little bit better and set pretty good pod sets on them. So I think one of the things too going into that is also the savings in cost. So trying to look at it from an economic standpoint, because all farmers, that's what we look at. Yield potential is one thing, but the economics to get there. So going down from 140,000 population to a 90,000 population is definitely saving money on the seed end of it. Going forward with that also, I think a lot of the varieties too, I know out in the Midwest, there's still a lot of 30-inch rows and 15-inch rows, but a lot of the drill beans, they're what I consider a stick bean. So you're really kind of getting away from that on the genetics too, where you don't have those semi-bush beans or full bush bean that, fills a row quicker. That also, instead of letting that sunlight go down to the ground, now you're getting it into the bean and you're getting that photosynthesis happening more to that plant and not wasting that energy. The other thing too is we've had a big increase, I think, in varieties that, like you said, with the heat stress tolerance on dry, ground, that the environment that we put them in too, Sean hit a little bit on it as far as variable rate. We don't have that technology here that we use on this farm, but trying to pick, we have a bunch of different soil types. We have different soil types in the same field. And I think a lot of that too is picking those varieties, the same as corn. You have beans that are a racehorse that are going to have, top end yield potential, but yet you get them in the wrong environment, they're not going to do anything. So trying to find that workhorse instead of that racehorse on marginal ground, I think also shrinks that yield gap too, because you're not wasting good genetics on ground that's not going to produce anything. And going forward with that also the fertility end of it, you're not going to try to push those yields with fertility or genetics or anything else on ground that's not capable of producing that. That's and the right timing too for it. The same as the 4 R's that we all use. We do some foliar treatment on soybeans as well when we come back in for our second dose of herbicide application. I don't know if I'm seeing as much difference in the foliar applications on soybeans. I think that sometimes it's a timing issue like everything else. Um, Going forward with that, I think fungicide treatments have been a little bit better. Even if the plant's not really showing disease, I think you're getting a healthier plant. So moving forward with the yield production that year, just like common sense, a healthier plant's going to yield better. Um, Other than that, I mean, one of the other things too, I think within the soybean world is the fact that are we getting towards, I mean, I know you have potential out there to grow 200 bushel the acre soybeans, but are we getting to a point too where the economics of pushing that, is it really worth that extra money economically that you're putting out? And I think that, we're getting close to that level. 70 bushel beans are pretty common now, where years ago that 40, 45 bushel beans were, doing something. So, you know, sustainability too with beans, same thing in a rotation. I mean, that's something that, their carbon sinks, they put it in the ground, their nitrogen sinks. Going back to a rotation thing where corn on corn, as Mr. Lauder's chart showed, maize on maize don't work as good as following with soybeans. And the cover crop thing too, I'm glad that Sean brought that up. I sit on a panel every once in a while with USB for Farmers for Soil Health. And that's another thing too, that I guess the biggest thing out of all this, going to Kansas, what was shown in wheat, Nebraska, wherever, here in Jersey, Northern Illinois, there's no silver bullet that fits everybody's cropping style. Now, using cover crops in Illinois, if we're going to soybeans, I'm guessing rye you spoke about because it'll keep growing. Here, if we're going back into corn, we look for a legume, so maybe a crimson clover or something to try to sequester some nitrogen for us, and not paying that carbon nitrogen penalty where rye, with corn and rye, it's really tough breaking that rye down, and especially if it's corn on corn with it. Now you got that other penalty on top of it, putting nitrogen down. And biologics maybe are a good answer to that, to get those microbes feeding, breaking that residue down, because we're running into that same problem. You start these 200, 250 corn yields, you got a lot of residue to contend with. So we create our own problems too, but we do try to solve them.
No doubt. Patrick, it looks like your dogs want some attention from you while you were speaking
Yes,
there.
I know, unfortunately, and I apologize for that. I just got home this morning and they've been wound up, and yeah.
No, no, they were you were able to maintain your focus. It was really impressive how you did that. Um, a really interesting question came in from Russell, Patrick, and before we open up the full panel to a question and answer, he's asking a question about keeping growers interested in sustainability, you know, s- during a potentially down or a down ag economy. How do you continue to focus on solving agronomic challenges and keep growers interested in regenerative agriculture, adopting conservation practices? Can you just speak to that and maintaining that focus?
Yeah, I think, once again, as I just said, there's not really a silver bullet that fits everybody. And, go into your local FSA office, NRCS, see what kind of programs they may have to maybe get you started. And, don't go nuts with it. It's one of those things too that, like I said, I'll take 20 acres, I'll take 40 acres and try something different with it. Uh, a lot of these guys, they think, well, we'll just go in 1,000 acres and do something. Well, then when it doesn't work out, it's left a bad taste in your mouth. And every year is different. So, I mean, some years, all right, with cover crops, we plant rye, we're going in soybeans, okay? So we go in and burn down the rye and plant through it. Well, a lot of years you get a wet spring like we had and cold. Cover crops, they're not the answer. The ground's not warming up. Now, if you're patient and you wait and get it planted, you'll probably see the benefits later on in the year with it. But, we all have time schedules too, unfortunately. And, it's one of those things that, cover crops, it takes patience and you have to trust, what you're doing with it. So yeah, I would suggest, doing a little bit here and there, seeing where your profitability level is. If, it's costing you another, I don't know, $20 an acre to put cover crop rye in, and you're coming back with soybeans next year into that field. See what your difference is, because once again, and do the whole thing, do a life cycle analysis with it, not only with the carbon end of it, but just your input costs. So I got a trip across the field with a 120-foot boom on the sprayer. That's a lot quicker than going out there with a disc or anything else and the fuel that you're burning doing that. So maybe the $18 or $20 it costs you in the rye seed is cheaper in the long run than going out in conventional tillage on that ground.
Sure. So test and learn. Sean, is that how when you started adopting biologicals, how did you incorporate that? How did you get the confidence to use those on your farm?
Yeah, I'd echo what Patrick said. I mean, you generally want to try it. And, I would say from even my career off the farm, you really need to commit to 3 years, because 1 year you're going to have a really good win. 1 year you're probably going to have a really bad win or a bad loss. And the next year it's probably going to be in the middle. And, there's just too many variables that play into those outcomes to say 1 year I'm not going to use that product. I don't think that's a fair shake to the product. So yeah, it's really been for me, what can I learn over 3 years, and try to give it its fairest shake. Probably not as extensive of a research project as the two doctors would like, but it's try it, see what you learn, talk with a bunch of neighbors and others who are using the product too, and then you make your decision to go all in or try the next product down the line.
Yeah, it sounds like a good approach to me. I want to give the next question to you, Jerry. This came in from Kevin Monk early on in terms of how do you quantify or understand the potential of cover crops and the impact on those on the yield gap of the other crops that are in that same rotation? How do you look at the whole cropping system instead of the individual crop?
Yeah, I think that this, when we always talk about yield gaps, we always talk about, well, what's yield gap on corn? What's yield gap on beans? I really think we need to start, and Sean and Patrick brought this up, is that we're really dealing with a system. I mean, we've got multiple crops in this, trying to figure out what the impact of a cover crop is in all of this. I think that when we start looking at this, I mean, we've got some new tools now. I mean, you look at all the intense remote sensing data that we have coming in. I mean, we can take a field out at a 1 square meter pixel size now and everything, and start looking at that. Preview of coming attractions. When we talk about the yield stability, we're going to talk about historical levels across. I mean, what are those different parts of the field that aren't responding, that are and parts that are responding across this? I think we start doing the same thing in terms of looking at how do we layer a corn, soybean, cover crop system together, and saying, what's that impact? And that'll just take and make that cloud map that Romulo put up there just a little bit more confusing because we'll have more colors on it. But it will give us insights into saying, what are some of the feedbacks that we look at? Because, and I'll bridge off to the question that was about sustainability, but I think the other piece of this is really how do we start thinking about resilience into this system? And when we look at this, and resilience is really kind of the base layer of sustainability. And resilience is how do we look at that ability to preserve our yield potential? And when we look at this, and you start saying, you know, what happens in all of these different pieces, now we get down to the individual field level and saying, what are parts of that field that may or may not be responding to a cover crop, and other parts that may be responding very nicely to a cover crop or to a biological. I mean, you look at humic acids in there. I mean, if you look at humic acids, they perform much better on poor soils than they do the good soils, and all of this. So how do we start looking at field variability and all these different pieces that come together and saying, what are avenues that we could help a producer use this data to make much better information in terms of a decision tool? Not saying that we're going to be perfect, but can we take and give an idea of what direction that arrow is going, and shifting that cloud that, you know, low yield, high return, you know, moving it over. And, you know, what are some of the things that are low hanging fruits in doing this, but more importantly, what are technologies? I think that the closing the yield gap on corn has been about preserving that photosynthetic capacity. If you really look at what we've done on corn, it's how do we take and make sure that we get that yield preserved along the way during the grain filling period. Either fungicides, some of the nutrient management that goes with that, the biologicals that we see with that. I think we can do the same thing on soybeans, but legumes tend to be a lot more complicated in terms of how they respond to some of these things than do a C4 plant. I think wheat responds differently than the other two crops. If we throw other crops into this system, we're going to see different responses. So I don't think we can take and say, well, we figured it out for corn, we can apply it to soybeans. That's not going to work that way. But I think that gives us a piece of saying, and we've got tools now. I mean, we're making some measurements. We're actually computing water use efficiency and light capture efficiency on a half-hour basis in crops, and looking and saying, and I'll just give you an example, because in a Mediterranean climate in Oregon, we see that as that soil dries, that we're very efficient in the morning, but that plant runs out of water in the afternoon, and so the efficiency is entirely different in the afternoon. And so how do we take that? But we don't see that when we've got other dynamics of that soil water process. So we can say, when does this plant get back to that point that Sean talked about? And saying, what's the impact of these cloudy days that are induced by smoke that really make us a much more diffuse radiation environment? And, you know, now we've got this shifting of whether we've got direct or diffuse and all of this, and what impact does that have on? We've got the techniques now with some of our instrumentation to be able to say, now we can quantify it. And we can quantify it at different spots across the field, look at the soil type, to now give more impact in that precision ag piece. It's a long, complicated answer, but it's a long, complicated problem. And we're going to have to figure out just how some of these dynamics interact with one another.
Yeah, well said. And you mentioned soil type, and Dr. Lollato, a question came in about that and the connection of soil type to GHGs. Would you like to comment about that? The question is really about high impact, low yield. You know, if we wanted to move high impact, low yield to low impact, high yield. Can you just speak a little bit more about that connection between GHGs and soil types?
Yeah, I can for sure that. So first, I will start with that's not my area of specialty, but I can speak within the context of what these projects that we're doing here, right? Essentially, if you think of in dryland systems, right, your soil type will impact your yield potential, right? Because that's the water holding capacity of that soil will impact your yield potential or in dryland conditions. And so within that context, it does impact your management as well, right? You're not going to manage a soil that sandy soil, it doesn't hold as much water, the same way that you would manage a nice silt loam soil in terms of inputs and whatnot. So I do think that, yes, it will play a role there to some extent, coming back to what Jerry was mentioning, making sure that we're using precision agricultural tools to manage those soils accordingly, right? And maybe mitigate some of that. Because if you're putting the same rate across the entire field that has two very contrasting soil types, very likely there will be much more losses in one type of soil versus the other, right? Depending on. So absolutely, it would impact there. Another thing I just wanted to very briefly mention here, on the question on how we keep growers engaged when we talk about sustainability, right? That has been a topic that went through my head quite a bit. And the reason for that is, in my appointment with the university, I'm 80% extension, meaning that I'm out there with the growers a lot of times, right? 80, 90 times a year, we're doing either a field day or a crop school or something along those lines. And when the interest came for sustainability and these life cycles and things like these, that was what I was thinking to myself. How am I going to, go to a county in Western Kansas and talk about that with our growers, right? How do we position that in a way that makes it interesting? And it really comes down to what both Patrick and Sean was mentioning, right? Profit, right? Can we put a number there and make sure that that profitability piece is an essential part of sustainability, right? So if you think of sustainability, you have, of course, production, but then you have economic, you have environmental, and you can even go into human part of it or even the social part of it, right? But in my limited experience, at least, the way that I was able to kind of capture some of their attention was here. We need to be more profitable, right? That's part of the sustainability of the system. So how can we be more profitable? And some of that data that we were working on was showing, first, we need to produce more yield. Okay, so how do we do that? And the other part of it, beyond being more profitable, is also keeping in mind that we need to produce more food, right? There's a growing population, we need to produce more food. So there's two reasons right there for us to push for yields, right? One of them is being more profitable. The other one, at a larger scale, is feeding a growing global population. So whenever we look at these metrics, right, global warming potential, or we can always look at a per area basis, so global warming potential per acre, right? But probably a metric that is better is per unit produced, right? Carbon equivalent, for example, per bushel, because then we are tackling both problems together. We're making sure that we're producing more, but then within that bushel, in that unit that we're producing, can we be more efficient in that, right? So those are the two ways that at least I found that seem to capture their attention, right? Okay, we need to make more money and produce more food. And so let's look at the metric instead of per area, looking at that per unit of food produced.
Thank you for that. Sean, I want to go to you if that's okay next. I know that Chad Fromm had asked you a question related to 45Z, and you had written a nice response, but I think it just went to the host and panelists. So I don't know that I want everyone to kind of get the benefit of your expertise. Can you explain how you responded to Chad, if you don't mind?
Sorry, yeah, user error there on everybody, but so yeah, the first sarcastic statement or response to your question, Chad, is we're anxiously awaiting the 45Z ruling because Lord only knows when that might actually hit. I was with a group the other day and we thought, oh, it would, in January of 25, it was going to be a thing, and here we are looking at January 26. So my response was there are certainly some pay for practice programs that are doing good things to get adoption of some of these practices on the ground. There are also some successful carbon programs that we know are working that are paying for tons of carbon. Now we can probably have another all-day discussion on what is the price being received, et cetera. and actually meeting with a group of folks today on that here at NCGA offices as well with soy and other industry partners. So, the 45Z credit does have the opportunity to improve the adoption of some of these climate smart practices, depending on how that final ruling, call it lands, to use the SAF pun here. The practices, as we alluded, not every practice works everywhere. And according to the NRCS practice standards, some of those really aren't that convenient. Certainly they vary by region. As we've talked about the complexities of just how do we manage the G by E by M and all the complexities that we talked about here today, those may be almost too rigid to truly make a broad scale impact as we think about climate smart ag practices really getting implemented at scale. So unfortunately, devil in the details there. And, I think for us as an organization, we are certainly cautiously optimistic of what becomes stackable versus not as we think about, Patrick and I both have interest in Farmers for Soil Health from our organizations. The reality of it is that is a government program, and therefore those acres may not qualify for 45Z, which then creates just another headache for a farmer to manage of, can I participate or can I not? And now all of a sudden, as we know, if things get too hard, what do? We just say, you know what, I'll wait for something easier. And, that's a watch out that we are trying to mitigate on the front side so we can be as clear as possible with our farmer members and communicating what programs can you stack for more return back to your farm versus what is not stackable and how do they navigate that, because it's going to get, I think, very confusing with 45Z and just, what's what.
Yeah, yeah, well said. Thank you for that, Sean. I think we all benefited from hearing that perspective. Patrick, I want to give you the final word here as we close in on the session. And both you and Sean are on the front lines managing this, adapting to what's coming at you. Any words of wisdom, advice, counsel that you give to others as we talk about continuing to close that row crop yield gap?
Well, like I said earlier, I don't think there's any one silver bullet, as we talked about, the cover crops, the sustainability, you name it. It's not a one size fits all. And I'm glad Sean brought that up too, that some of these programs are so rigid that nobody really wants to implement into it. And the other thing is some of them are like 3-year, 5-year contracts, so on and so forth. And it's like, well, do I really want to put myself into that position for 3 years? I might want to change something up, or, this isn't working out now. I've already signed up for this. So, I mean, I think flexibility is the biggest thing that we need to look at, that, keeping farmers flexible to adapt to programs. And, if it is a cover crop or something, look, we can do this on a 3-year basis, but if I can't make 1 year, I'm not going to be penalized for it because it was too wet to get in the fall to get the cover crop planted, but a lot of it too is planting dates. I mean, I had signed up for some programs before, and it's got to be in the ground by September 30th. And well, I don't have the crops off yet. It's been raining for 3 weeks straight. So, what would you like me to do at this point? And I think that, overall, it's just a big picture. I mean, Dr. Hatfield and Dr. Lollato, have some great charts and all those things and great information that we can all use. But, when it comes down to the reality of farming practices, we're still subservient to the weather. And we can't change that. Talking about the fires and the smoke that you had up there. We got a little bit of it down here, but not to the extent that we had before. We had our, normal forest fires here in New Jersey. And, it does. It's an impact on the crops. To what extent, do we really know? I couldn't tell you. I don't have the metrics to prove or not prove that. But no, I think, going forward to your point of, what do we do? I think looking, like you said, a lot of things Sean talked about, I talked about, the good doctors talked about, that it's all hands on deck. It's all different things. Take those metrics. I mean, what you were talking about is of layering these different things on these maps. I mean, we do that anyway. We know what fertility practices we use in the field. If it is a variable rate program, we know what soil types we're on. With corn, maybe do we cut back to a 26, 28,000 population on these sand hills, bump it up to 34, 36,000 when it's under irrigation. There's a lot of things to close it. I think, the seed companies and the people that we deal with, our nutrient people that we deal with, there's a lot of different things coming out there that are going to help close this. Genetics have definitely improved, no doubt about that. We're and especially too, going back to our toolbox, the genetics that we have now with the traits in there for different chemistries to be put on, that's helped out a lot on the pesticide, on weed control. The rotation going into it, it's a, it's a living thing as we're doing this, and there's nothing really, it's a try. Look at your neighbors in your area, what they're doing, talk to them, sit down at the coffee shop, what worked for you. Talking about the algae and stuff. We had tried some kelp-based stuff years ago. It worked. Little bit. Don't, go nuts with it once again. But I think overall, as farmers, we are improving vastly every year. And I think too that, we're also, like I said, I think some of it, we're getting to that plateau of where do we push yield versus where is it economically sound to do it. And, I think overall we're doing a good job as stewards.
Yeah,
And
I don't think there's any doubt about that, Patrick. I'm really encouraged actually after this conversation. I think there's clearly potential to continue to close that yield gap, better managing nitrogen, better water practices, other regenerative ag practices that are already being adopted by you and others there. I want to thank each of you, Drs. Hatfield and Lollato, Sean and Patrick, for your perspectives today. I do have one other slide I wanted to share with everyone. We have, and I referenced this earlier, but we've got a webinar planned for December the 10th, and we've got a new study that's closely related to the topic that we're talking about today that is being done by Dr. Jerry Hatfield, Dr. Bruno Basso from Michigan State, called Enhancing Farm Profitability Through Nitrogen Efficiency and Yield Stability. This is a new piece of research we're actually going to launch at COP30 in Brazil next month. This work is supported by Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative, Wisconsin Soybean Board, and the Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council. So you can scan that QR code, register for that webinar, and we hope to see you all there. Again, thanks to the speakers. Thank you all for attending. Have a great rest of your day.